Okay, chapter 31. The Gospel according to Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew presents at once phenomena of the most varied and inexplicable character, while many of its narratives and of its records of the sayings of Christ from the brevity and simplicity are recognized as among the oldest traditions, and as having been taken from near the fountainhead, the Gospel itself bears, in other places, internal evidence of a comparatively late origin. The persistent statements of Jerome, supported by Epiphanius, that the Gospel of the Hebrews was the Hebrew form of the Gospel of Matthew, statements not at all borne out by the fragments of the Gospel of the Hebrews which they have given, still further complicate a question in other respects sufficiently difficult. Many writers, not willing to discard altogether the assertions of Jerome and Epiphanius, have supposed our Matthew to be a translation from a more correct version of the Hebrew Gospel than that quoted by those fathers, and that the differences between those quotations and the Greek Matthew are to be accounted for, partly by the difference in the Hebrew versions and partly by the freedom of translation. Among these, Bishop Marsh is one of the most eminent. Others, giving but little credit to these fathers, whom in other matters they have found so unreliable, and resting the case upon internal evidence, have pronounced the Gospel of Matthew an original Greek production. This view is strongly maintained by Jones and other modern critics. The manuscripts of Luke compared with Matthew. There is a partial parallel in the third chapter of Matthew to the first part of manuscript number 7, Luke 3, 1-22, omitting the genealogies, which are entirely different. The parallel is resumed and more closely followed in the history of the temptation. MS number 8, Luke 4, 16-30, has no parallel in Matthew. Number 9, Luke 4, 31-44, which had a complete parallel in Mark, finds only a partial parallel in Matthew, commencing with verse 38 of Luke, Matt 8:14, and giving an account of the healing of Simon's wife's mother and other sick people. We early find evidence of that tendency to amplification and exaggeration which is characteristic of the author of this gospel, although in accordance with the accounts in the other synoptics, he states in verse 16 that when the even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed of devils, and he cast out the spirits with the word and healed all that were sick, adding, according to his custom, a reference to the fulfillment of prophecy. And though he had also stated in chapter 4, verse 23, that Jesus went about all Galilee teaching, etc., and healing all manners of sickness and all manner of disease among the people, he there adds, after the narrative has been closed by the other historians, the following. Verse 24. And his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought unto him all sick people that were taken with divers diseases and torments, and those who were possessed with devils, and those who were lunatic, and those who had the palsy, and he healed them. Manuscript number 10, Luke 5, 1-11, cannot be traced to Matthew, though there is a shorter account of the calling of the 4 disciples corresponding to that in Mark. Number 11, Luke 5, 12-16. The parallel account of Matthew is shorter than in Luke or Mark. This is one of the places which indicate Matthew as containing the earlier narrative. The account of this miracle as related in the Acts of Pilate is shorter than either of these. Number 12, Luke 5, 17-26, parallel Matthew 9, 1-8. Number 13, Luke 5, 27-39, see Matthew 9, 9-17, which has a close resemblance. So also number 14, Luke 6, 1-11, Matthew 12, 1-13. Number 15, Luke 6, 12-7 and 10. The last 10 verses of this manuscript describing the healing of the centurion's servant are paralleled in Matthew 8, 5-13. The other portion, which commences with the choosing of the 12 and consists principally of saying of Jesus, can hardly be considered parallel by the Sermon on the Mount, which is much more extensive. Number 16, Luke 7, 11-50, which has no parallel in Mark, has a partial parallel in Matthew. See Luke 7:18-35 and Matthew 11:2-19. Number 17, Luke 8:1-21. See Matthew 13:1-25 and 12:46-50, where the parallel is nearly complete. Number 18, Luke 8:22-56, parallel Matt 8:18, verses 23-34, chapter 9, 18-25. 19, Luke 9:1-45, Matt 10:1-15, 14, 1-2, verses 13-21, chapter 16, 13-16, 20, verses 21-28, and chapter 17, 1-23. This manuscript, if used at all, is completely broken up. 20, Luke 9:46-50, Matthew 18:1-6. 21, Luke 9:51-10. 10:24. All right, got it. Partial parallel in Matt 8:19-22. Manuscript 22, 23, and 24. Luke 10:25-11:13. No parallel in Matthew. Number 25, Luke 11:14-13:9. Partial parallel Matthew 12:22-30 and verse 38-45. 26-29, Luke 13:10-17:19. No parallel. Number 30, Luke 17:20-19:48. The first division, 17:20-18:14, has no parallel. The first part of second division, 18:15-30, has a parallel. Matt 19:13-30. Luke 18:31-43 has Matt 20:17-19 and 20:29-34. Luke 19:29-38 has Matthew 21:1-9, and Luke 19:45-46 has Matt 21:12-13. These partial parallels do not, however, identify the manuscript. Number 31, Luke chapters 20 and 21, partial parallels, Matt 21:23-27, 33-45, chapters 22, verses 15-32, verse 41-46, chapter 23, verse 5-7, verse 14, and chapter 24, verse 1-44, following which are lengthy sayings of Christ found in Matthew alone. Number 32, Luke 22, 1-23 and 49, Matt 26, 3-5, 14-25, the parallel considerably broken, Matt 27, 1-11-56. Number 33, Luke 23-50 to the end. Some partial parallels, Matt 27-57 to the end. Recapitulation. 5 of the manuscripts are complete in Matthew, though with the customary changes and accumulation. Some dozen of the others have parallels more or less extensive. There is indicated a common use of manuscripts, though not to so great an extent as by the authors of Luke and Mark. We will now proceed to consider some of the indications of a late date for the construction of the Gospel of Matthew. 1. That Matthew was written for theological purposes and for the use of the church after it had become pretty well established, is shown by the frequent reference to the prophecies and the manifest anxiety to show that the events related were in fulfillment of the predictions referred to. True, the author is quite uniformly unfortunate in his selection of prophecies, scarcely one of which has any reference to the subject matter to which it is applied, but the object of the writer is nevertheless apparent. 2. The comparatively late composition of this work may be inferred from the many additions of incidences of a striking and marvelous character not contained in the other Gospels. Notably among these are the earthquakes at the crucifixion and the resurrection, both of which were known to this historian only. Also the opening of the graves and the rising of the saints. Schittelmacher, in comparing Luke with Mark and Matthew, sees evidence that the corresponding narratives in the latter Gospels were originally more hastily taken down and were obscured by passing through a great number of hands. Speaking of the account of casting out the devils, Matt 8:28-33, he says, the alteration made here by introducing two demonics in itself improbable, as it is not unusual for madmen to contact a close friendship and intimacy with each other, might indeed admit of a different explanation, as other instances of a similar duplication are found in Matthew. In regard to the feeding of the multitudes, notwithstanding the statement in Matthew 16, Schittelmacher thinks there was but one feeding and that Matthew was misled by having two different accounts of the same transaction. Speaking of Matt 16:13-28, he says, "No one will readily believe that Christ in the same breath, as it were, would deliver to Peter the key of the kingdom of heaven, and then call him a Satan, who did not favor the things which be of God." He thinks the manner in which Matthew represents the transfiguration shows that the account had passed through several hands. In this narrative, he says, one perceives the exclusive direction of the reporter's imagination towards the marvelous. On this account, the assertion that the two figures were Moses and Elias appear far more confident than in Luke, in whose narrative every attentive reader easily sees that it is founded merely on the expression of Peter in a state between sleeping and waking. In the same way, we may remark likewise in the healing of the epileptic in Matthew a distortion in extravagance. After commenting at length upon the circumstance, he says, Matthew, therefore, either has had a less authentic reporter here, or perhaps only obscured the state of the case by his habit of annexing an analogous matter. In the account in Matthew corresponding to Luke 19:46-50, Schittelmacher thinks much is annexed with was not spoken on the occasion. He comments on the incoherence in the narratives of Matthew. Referring to the duplication of the blind men at Jericho, he says Matthew had before done something of the same sort in the case of the demonic, I think, at Gadara. How the mistake happened, he does not undertake to determine. Speaking of Matt 21:1-17, he says, as to what is said in Matthew, somewhat strangely indeed, of two animals, I can only explain it by the attempt to make the application of the fact to the passage in Zechariah as close as possible. Any other explanation appears to be lost labor. For if Matthew is to be reconciled with the rest, it must have been properly the polos which Christ bespoke for himself. But when the polos is able to bear the weight of a man, though it has never been ridden, the she-ass no longer runs by its side, but has long left it to itself. He thinks the rending of the veil poetical, so also the opening of the graves and the rising of the saints from the dead as related by Matthew. 3. One circumstance indicating a late date for this gospel is the passage, Matt 23:35. That upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachas, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. In Luke, this is quoted from the apocryphal book called the Wisdom of God, and is applied to Zacharias, who perished between the altar and the temple. Luke 11:49-51. The passage was not Marcion. In Luke, though the place of the death of Zechariah is not described with entire correctness, the reference is in all probability to Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. But this was ending a long way back the list of prophets whose blood had been shed unjustly. The author of Matthew, wishing to bring it down to a latter date, adds son of Barachias. This changes the personage at once and brings the scene down to a date subsequent to the time of Christ. Zacharias, son of Baruchos, was massacred by the Zealots inside the temple shortly before the siege of Jerusalem, about AD 69. It is evident that this portion of the Gospel of Matthew was written not only after the destruction of Jerusalem, but a long time after. It will be noticed that these words are not here, as in Luke, quoted from the wisdom of God. They are put into the mouth of Jesus himself, who is made to allude to an event as in the past, which took place more than 30 years after. No one writing immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem could have made such a mistake, but a writer living more than 100 years afterwards might do so. Suppose 1,000 years hence a history should be under examination which should represent Andrew Jackson as speaking of something as then past which had occurred near our own time, say the death of Senator Chandler. Would not that be evidence that the history was written not only after the death of Chandler, but a long time after? 4. In Matthew 27:8, after stating that the chief priests took the silver pieces which Judas had thrown away and brought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in, it is added, wherefore that field was called the field of blood unto this day. The phrase unto this day implies a very long time between the transaction and the time of relating it. So again, Matt 28:15, in relating the bribing of the soldiers by the chief priests, there is the following. So they took the money and did as they were taught, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. 5. Evidence of the late construction of Matthew is to be found in an attempt in the 16th chapter to specially connect Peter with the foundation of the Christian church. The narrative of the conversation between Jesus and Peter, as given in Luke and Mark, contains nothing of the kind. That this was a later interpolation in the gospel history made in the interest of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, then being established, will become more manifest by comparing the accounts in the synoptic gospels as follows. How do I want to do this? Shoot. Maybe I'll put both pages up at the same time. I'll read all of... I don't know how to read that. Yeah, I'm thinking. I'm going to read all Luke first, then Mark, then Matthew. Luke chapter 9:18. His disciples were with him, and he asked them, saying, Whom say the people that I am? They, answering, said, John the Baptist, but some say Elias, the others say that one of the old prophets is risen again. He said unto them, But whom say ye that I am? Peter answering said, The Christ of God. And he straitly charged them and commanded them to tell no man that thing. Mark chapter 8:27. And by the way he asked his disciples, saying unto them, Whom do men say that I am? And they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elias, and others one of the prophets. 29. And he saith unto them, But whom say ye that I am? And Peter answereth and saith unto him, Thou art Christ. And he charged them that they should tell no man of him. Matthew chapter 16:13. He asked his disciples, saying, Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they said, Some say John the Baptist, some Elias, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He saith unto them, But whom say ye that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then charged his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. From the closeness of the parallel, it is obvious that the account was taken from a common manuscript or from a common tradition. The saying of Christ to Peter, Blessed art thou, etc., if it had ever been uttered, was too important to be omitted by the other historians. It is a manifest interpolation made to give gospel sanction to the hierarchy said to have been established by Peter. About this time, AD 180 to 190, a violent dispute had arisen concerning the celebration of Easter. The church at Rome was endeavoring to control the question and to make it the occasion for the establishment of a supreme power. The Asiatic churches had rebelled against its pretensions. It was very important to conciliate them. Let us suppose that at this juncture this gospel had appeared at Alexandria, whose bishop supported Rome. It would at once be adopted in the churches of Africa, Gaul, and Italy, all of which were favorable to the papal claims. It would then be circulated in Asia Minor among the churches imbued with Jewish traditions, and among whom the name of Peter was all-powerful and would have an immense influence in favor of consolidation. Hold on. The Epistle of Clement of Rome to James was, it is to be presumed, already in circulation, in that it was stated that Peter had at Rome given to Clement in the presence of the congregation the keys of the kingdom, and had used almost the very words here attributed to Jesus. Peter had said of Clement to the church, "Wherefore I communicate to him the power of binding and loosing, so that with respect to everything which he shall ordain in the earth, it shall be decreed in the heavens. He shall bind what ought to be bound, and loose what ought to be loosed, as knowing the rule of the church." It only needed a gospel showing that Christ had conferred this power upon Peter, and the chain of title of the Roman pontiff was complete. When, where, and by whom written? No writer of the first centuries ever assigned a date to the Gospel of Matthew except Irenaeus, whose testimony is generally discarded. He states that it was written for the Jews while Peter and Paul were founding the church at Rome. If, says Bishop Marsh, the arguments in favor of a late date for the composition of St. Matthew's Gospel being compared with those in favor of an early date, it will be found that the former greatly outweigh the latter. According to the law of accretion, Matthew would stand next to Luke in point of antiquity. On the other hand, it has been seen that several considerations point forcibly to a late date for its composition. It remains to be considered whether there is any theory which will explain these seemingly contradictory phenomena. We venture to make a suggestion which, if not entirely correct, may lead to such inquiries as will result in a correct solution. About AD 180, Pantaleus was sent from Alexandria as a missionary to India. It is said that he there found a Gospel of Matthew which had been left in India many years before by Bartholomew, who had preached in that country. There has been much discussion as to what this Gospel of Matthew, sometimes called the Gospel of Bartholomew, was. Let us suppose it was a copy of the Oracles of Matthew to which had been attached some brief narrative of the ministry of Christ. It would be, in that case, one of the oldest copies in existence. Suppose this copy was brought back to Alexandria accompanied with some old manuscripts of genealogies that some zealous Christian in that city, wishing to aid in the consolidation of the church, then going on, undertook from these and other materials to write a new gospel, that it was published in Alexandria. Such a work would fulfill all the conditions and would exhibit the complex character now found in the Gospel of Matthew. The oracles and accompanying narrative would furnish, in some cases, the most authentic records and in the shortest and simplest form of any yet published, and this would of itself justify an addition to the Gospels then in circulation. The author would have before him the Gospels of the infancy and the Gospels of Mark and Luke. That Pantaleus was a Jew we learn from Clement of Alexandria, who speaks of him as a Hebrew of Palestine, whom he found concealed in Egypt, and who was the true Sicilian bee, gathering the spoil of the flowers of the prophetic and apostolic meadow.